There's been no issue in sports over the past couple of years that has gotten much attention, both inside sports and outside sports, that's bled over to the news section. Then social activism is kind of a generic name, and we've called it sticking to sports or not. We will deal with that issue here. Obviously, the focal point has been a lot on kneeling and Colin Kaepernick. We're sort of going to take the conversation even more of a bigger level, deeper themes on what athletes should do about politics or not. Anxious and excited to have these voices with us. Moderating with me is Penny Lee. She's now with 1776, former senior advisor to Harry Reid and longtime advisor to someone you know here, former Governor Ed Rendell. Great to have Penny with us. On the panel, Glenn Bracey. Glenn is relatively new to Villanova, sociology professor in social movements and critical race theory. When this issue was front and center, I asked around the university who to have to come to my class. There was no one better than Glenn. He has synthesized this issue after years of research. Great to have you, Glenn. Also here, Toni Smith-Thompson. In talking to people around the country about voices in this area, this name kept coming up. And I reached out, and we're lucky to have her. She has been involved on this issue for years and years, and did something similar to Kaepernick years and years ago. So this has been going on quite a while. Erin Elmore is a contributor with many broadcast networks, including Fox News, CNN, worked with the Republican National Convention, worked with the Trump campaign, has been involved on all aspects of media on this issue. It's great to have Erin. Justin Tuck. You heard of him? Former New York Giant, former Oakland Raiders Super Bowl champion twice. And I think most importantly, 2 weeks away from graduating from Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. Like Gary in the first panel, Justin comes and visits our symposium when Villanova wins the national championship. He was here 2 years ago as well. Another team won a championship here this year, didn't they? Let's start. And again, this is kind of a blank canvas. And I think I'll start with Toni, because it was 15 years ago that as a collegiate basketball player, tell us what you did.
I was a senior at Manhattanville College. I was the co-captain of the women's basketball team. And toward the start of the season, I decided that I was no longer going to participate in the pregame playing of the national anthem. And for the duration of that season, when the national anthem was played, I stood about face. And it drew a lot of attention, a lot of backlash, and I think the response that I saw then is pretty akin to the response we're seeing now to Colin Kaepernick, both in content and in scope.
How do you describe that response?
Fierce. There was actually a good mix. This was before social media, so the response that I got were mostly in the form of letters and emails, and of course there was tons of conversation over sports news channels. And most of the letters that I got personally were letters of support, but the kind of the content of the strength of the backlash often made it seem like that was stronger and was the majority. And so a lot of the backlash that I got was pretty similar to what we're seeing now. I was called unpatriotic. I was told that it was disrespectful. I was told to leave the country in not as nice words, and was called a slew of derogatory names. And it continued from there.
I would be curious to know what the issue it was that you were protesting, or what caused you to feel like to do the about face, and to broaden it up to the larger panel, and that is, do we see a hypocrisy amongst those? We sometimes cheer, obviously, Jesse Owens in 36. We see Jackie Robinson breaking the race barrier. We see the Williams sisters being able to have equity as far as how they are paid. We also see things happening with the Me Too movement and how it brings out sexual abuse within the sports entity. Is there a hypocrisy? Because maybe your issue, what the issue it was that you turned about face, wasn't as popular, or didn't bring the equality that the people felt? So I want to open it up to the larger panel.
Yes, there's a hypocrisy. I'll say for me, I was not a professional player, and I played for a school that is a Division III sports program. So if you know Division III sports programs, you don't do anything on the court that you want to get national attention, right? We just don't have that following. My friends didn't even go to the games, right? It's very small. So, so there was no expectation that any protest or conduct on the court would go beyond the court. But I got to the point, I was a sociology major, and I think I got to a place where this was the post 9/11 era. And so this brand of American patriotism and American freedom felt less like individual freedoms and more like America as an institution's freedom to dominate, to enact violence, both domestically and abroad, and to have the freedom to do that even when that violence is enacted upon our own communities, often with impunity. And as someone who had become very involved in social justice movements in college, I was faced with this small sliver of a way that I could make a choice that would further justice the way I saw. And it was a test for me to say, if I'm serious about getting to a future that is more just, do I have the courage to make this choice and to take a stand against a practice that I feel like is perpetuating the narrative that it's okay to commit acts of violence against our own people, that it's okay to not actually represent a democracy where we're all valued. And if I didn't have the courage to do that, then who was I really?
What I really appreciate about what you're saying is that you pull out the false narrative of neutrality. That there's a notion when we think about social movements in sports that there's an option for the players to just be neutral, that to be silent and to not draw national attention to yourself is neutrality around social justice issues. It's not. The obligation for silence or for not drawing attention is to facilitate universities or owners, depending on who is making the money, to be able to make that money the most easily and to draw it from as many groups as possible. That's not neutral, especially given that the universities, the ownership groups, et cetera, tend to be pushing a very conservative set of policies. So if you're going to do social justice or push for equality in any way, it's going to require the kind of bold moves that you took. Simply playing the game or shutting up, as it were, is not a practicable option if what you're looking for is actual justice.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's what is the end game, right? Because if you look at statistics within the NFL this year, let's see, Super Bowl 2018 had a 7% loss in viewership. It was the lowest since 2009. And the NFL TV ratings are down 10% from last season. And to say that that is not part and parcel with the social movement, it would be a difficult argument to make. And I guess if the end game is to play football, which the opportunity to do so is, the statistics on that are crazy, just to become a professional football player. It's what is your end game? Is your end game to be a social justice warrior, or is it to play football? And I think that there has to be that distinction, that you have to ask yourself that question, because it is having greater impacts. It's changing viewership, it's changing how you're seen, it's changing what endorsement deals you're getting. So I think you can talk about it in theory, but in practice, it's a whole nother implication.
Well, I think that you can do both. I don't understand why an athlete can't play the game that he loves, but also champion the causes that are very, very important to him and people around him or her. I feel as though the platform that we are, and I'll speak specifically for the NFL, the platform the NFL has given me as a former NFL player is tremendous. But I also feel as though I have an obligation, for all my Bible readers out there, when much is given, much is due. I feel that I have an obligation to champion the causes or help be a voice for voiceless or powerless faces in this country, and you name it. I think the hot topic, button right now is Kaepernick's kneeling, but there's so many other ways of activism that athletes have been involved in, whether that's education, which would be probably number one on my list, or women's suffrage, or the LGBT, or criminal justice reform. There's so many ways of activism that our guys have found ways to champion that cause and use the platform that has been given us, and also be really, really good at the sport that they play. So I feel as though, I agree with you, there needs to be more dialogue, there needs to be more transparency what the end game is, and I think sometimes that gets lost, but I truly believe that you can do both.
But there will be repercussions, financial or otherwise.
Well,
It's a balancing test.
Absolutely. But
it's a balancing test. What do you want? Are you going to lose those endorsements? Are you okay with the ratings being lower? Are you okay with isolating half of the population and having viewership be down? It's just, what is your end game? And the people in the military feel that half of them, they sit there and say, I'm in a wheelchair, I can't stand. You should stand because I can't. I fought our country. So you're kneeling, it's just blatantly disrespectful to the military.
Well, I've had many conversations with veterans in my town, excuse me, can you hear me? Yeah. I've had many conversations with veterans across this country that said the reason why they are were in the military, are in a wheelchair now, is to give us that voice. They fought for us to have that freedom.
I don't think that's true.
What do they fight for?
I mean, they can't, the flag is something that they put their whole life on the line for. When people in the military die, they put a flag on their casket.
Well, there's black men dying in our country.
Those are two separate issues.
Actually, I don't think they're separate issues. I think one of the criticisms that I got when I protested was about the military. And I think to define patriotism narrowly as people who serve inside the military excludes all of the other ways that people can be of service to their country. And so I don't think that it's any different to end up in a wheelchair because you've been shot by a police officer, or end up in a wheelchair because you're in the line of in combat, right? There are different ways to be in service to your country, and to say that the flag represents the military only begs the question, then what flag is for me?
Oh, no one ever said that.
I think one thing I want to get back to is repercussions, and you use the word consequences.
That's all I'm talking about, is statistics and repercussions.
And obviously, Kaepernick has suffered consequences.
He's at home sitting on his couch.
As a former player, if a current player was going to come to you and say, I really feel this way, but I'm looking at what happened to Kaepernick, and Eric Reed is not getting signed, how do you deal with that?
Well, I was definitely going to touch on that, and again, I can only speak for Justin Tuck. I can't speak for Kaepernick. I can't speak for who else. But I've weighed this. Obviously, I retired the year that Kaepernick started to kneel, and I've been asked this question many a times. Justin, if you're still in the league, would you have kneeled? And we talked offline about this, me and you personally. And I said, I don't know. Times have changed, right? But if you look at it, you always, in anything you do, you evaluate the risk of that, the risk reward of that. So for me personally, in 2016, I was financially stable. So losing Nike, losing Subway, losing whoever else was sponsoring me, I didn't really care if I was very passionate about that cause. So the risk for me wasn't as great as it might have been for other guys. But I also say this. I also say that, for a young guy coming to me, I would say, you can't not do something just because you're thinking that someone else might take something away from you. Think about all the other people in this world that you have a platform to change something for them that they're currently getting things taken away from them. So for me personally, if I was a rookie that wasn't financially stable, I still would have found a way to use my platform to be a part of this movement. And I think it's very important that for me as a veteran now retired football player to voice that to these young guys, because think about it from this perspective. Look how powerful the Parkland teenagers have been, because they have a movement, they've created a movement that you have young people that are aligned and synergized in one singular focus. Think about that from the perspective we could find a way for all of our athletes, not just the NFL, the NBA, the baseball league, hockey, whatever you want to call it. If we can find a way to pull together our resources to be a singular focus and aligned focus, things like that change the world. And it doesn't have to be pretty. Like, when has reform, when has speaking up for the oppressed, any of that been pretty? That's why it's protesting. It's supposed to kind of get at something here. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to enact us going and having being in uncomfortable situations, but also having uncomfortable dialogue. That's how progress happens. If you're comfortable, nothing changes. And obviously, you're blind if you can't see that this country has problems and there needs to be voice for people that can't be voices for themselves.
And let's be clear, because I want to push a little against the framing of the conversation thus far, in that it's about athletes and it's about the consequences that they take. There are more than just athletes involved. The owners, for instance, in the Kaepernick thing, this is not a series of natural consequences, right? These are punishments and sanctions that a collective group, namely the owners, largely white and male, are using their collective power to push a particular agenda, which is largely young black people be silent, make us money, and allow us to use that money to advance their, frankly, white supremacist agenda.
Wow.
And then they have a conversation that says, well, you made the choice to be risky. Well, no, actually, this is a choice that you're making to advance your agenda. The owners or the conservatives are as much activist as Kaepernick is, or as LeBron James is, or Reed is. And we need to start seeing the status quo as not nature or neutral, but see the status quo as the reality of an aggressive group of people actively silencing people, actively saying, be shot in the street and don't say anything about it, actively saying, you work for us, and think of yourselves as our objects and subjects and slaves, and not as individuals who are connected to society and have a platform and have the right to speak and advocate for yourselves.
But isn't the NFL a corporation? And everyone is an at-will employee. If they don't like it, they can leave. And they can go be an activist.
Again, the idea that it has to be a choice, which I think Justin already spoke to, is a false choice. And the idea that it's all about the players making these choices is also false. So I think we've corrected the frame already. We don't need to go back to
I think that's still an accurate
mistaken
statement.
view.
I still stand behind the statement that it is the way that I'm framing it. Because first of all, to call it a white supremacist agenda, I think you lose a lot of people right there, including myself. But
Not me.
well, I'll speak for myself. But having said that, I think that just like a corporate, let's talk about real life implications as opposed to sociology for a minute. If you're gonna go work at a corporation, everyone's an at-will employee, okay? In the real life and in the real world, if you do something that your boss doesn't like, you're an at-will employee and you can be fired for it. And those are the consequences of putting on your big girl pants and putting on your big boy pants and living in the real world.
So I don't know, do you think you can see into other dimensions? I'm sitting right here in the real world.
Just sociology is talk about theory. I'm talking about practice and numbers and
Sociology
facts.
is an empirical science, although we're not here to discuss the technical aspects of my discipline. The point is, there are people taking actions in the same way that you are actively trying to present the players as
employees,
as rightful victims here. Because they're making the choice to stand up for themselves.
They can go cry in their mansions.
And you're presenting the owners as people who are just defending money. The truth is that the owners are defending power, they're defending their racial identity, and they're advocating for their money in a particular way that is based on the oppression, largely, of people of color. And we cannot ignore that.
Let me ask a question real quick on Justin. You're part of the Alliance for American Football, which is a new league that is coming in that will be playing post the regular NFL season. This is the first time in which former athletes are actually part of management. So they will be part of ownership and part of shaping how this league is run. Do you think having that access or being part of that conversation will change when a social movement comes about, when the next take a knee? Will the league handle it anyway differently?
Well, I think our stance at the Alliance, and basically the Alliance, why we named it Alliance is because we truly want to be in partnership with our stakeholders. We truly want to be in partnership with our fan base and our players. We don't have a franchise model, so there won't be a model of an owner, the tier model of that. But that being said, because we do have players in management, I think we have a focus on, again, being in line with our stakeholders. So our policy is simple. If you believe in something, like let's just take the kneeling in the flag. If you're on the field, we expect you to stand at the flag. But we also encourage our players, they'll have options as far as staying in the locker room as protests. It's just, it helps us to kind of get away from all the gray area. So that's our policy. We want to be clear in how we I guess partner with our players, because it's not like we're saying don't protest. Absolutely not. Again, I think I summarized how I would go about it personally. I think a lot of my feelings about this is been very, very much deemed the same with our our CEO and our people of operations. So again, going forward, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know exactly what the new movement will be, but I know for a fact that we will try our best to be in partnership with that movement and pool our resources to support our players in any way that we can.
Toni, you've talked about sports and politics, and this panel is emblematic of what's going on in terms of should they be intertwined or not? And that's a question we always ask. This is not new. I mean, you were 15 years ago, we talked about Bill Russell and Jim Brown and back in the day, and it's not new with Kaepernick, even in the recent years, and we've seen LeBron and the hoodies after Trayvon Martin. Is it going to get even more intertwined as we go forward in this era of social media and everything going on? Is there a way to separate sports and politics?
Well, sports are political. I mean, the national anthem is political. So if we're going to have a conversation about separating politics from sports, you got to start there. So I think coming from that place where it has been political since World War I, when the practice started, then what I think we're seeing now is not that it's becoming more intertwined, more political. We're seeing a balance of it. We're seeing a balance of political views so that as athletes, we are not solely used to further one political agenda, but are actually pushing back and saying, we're full people on the court, we're full people off the court, and you don't get to separate sports from society because it's just a microcosm of it.
But society doesn't feel the same way, as evidenced by the statistics and the numbers and the viewership being down and the seats being empty. So there's a disconnect between what the American people think and this movement.
Well, listen, I love basketball. I don't love it enough to step on other people's freedom to play it, right? You're balancing an experience you have, a profession you have, with all of the other pieces of democracy that we say we want. So yeah, sports is great, the NFL is great, we love sports. Do we love sports more than democracy, or do we need to find a way for sports to coexist with it?
Again, I'm just going back to just the statistics about what the viewers at home think. I think that they want to turn on the TV on Sunday after they've worked and had a hard week, and they just want to watch a football game and have a nice afternoon instead of having someone shove an agenda down their throat.
I think you're confusing some of the success of activism with actually a loss of or a conservative populace. So, for instance, people have been saying we're going to stop watching the NFL because of the CTE issue, or people are saying we're not going to watch the NFL because they've kept Colin Kaepernick off the field, and then you want to use the lower ratings to suggest that that's opposition to Kaepernick, when in fact there's every reason to believe that that is at least half support for the social movement that we're talking about, right? And then the notion that society is against it, as though the people who are activists, the people of color communities, the women communities that are part of hashtag #MeToo, for instance, are not part of society. That's precisely the type of white supremacist and sexist rhetoric and framing that I was talking about.
Well, it clearly hasn't brought new viewers because the numbers are still down. So this kind of activism certainly hasn't created more popularity for the sport.
Well, I
But you're
haven't looked at
also
the-
narrowly focusing it on one sport. What about the broadening? What about the fact that the Williams sisters were able to bring equity into the tennis tournaments and the purses that were there? What about the women that are speaking out about Larry Nassar? Is that not, instead of trying to say an either or, they're either an athlete or an activist, can't they be both?
In those situations, it's a totally different circumstance. And
So it's a pick and choose?
no, not at all. We're talking about football and politics. We're talking about women and sexual
Sports
abuse.
and
So that's the answer
We're talking
there.
about sports and politics.
Yeah, so being sexually abused has something to do with politics? Not in my book.
Well, I think what Glenn was saying is we have two issues here. We have maybe there are declining ratings, and maybe owners do want athletes to stick to sports. But they can't impose that. They can impose consequences for athletes who don't. But again, I think it's a lot of it is talent related. If a superstar was doing all the things that other players are, they're not going to release the superstar.
Same with the rape allegations. The Seattle Seahawks kept an accused and arrested rapist, but didn't hire, Colin Kaepernick. So
Right.
careful what you clap for.
49ers, right. What are you thinking, Justin?
So much. I don't know much. How much time we got?
20 minutes.
Yeah, I think it's important.
all day.
I think it's important to look at activism in a perspective as well. For example, we mentioned some history about Jackie Robinson and Jesse Owens, and I'll throw Muhammad Ali in that group. If we were back in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s when that was taking place, and the 30s with Jesse Owens, if you take yourself back to that time frame, when those initial stances were taking place, they were not looked upon favorably. Would everybody agree with that? I think everybody would agree. Mr. Ali not wanting to be drafted was looked upon with death threats and so on and so forth. Now, fast forward to today. All three of those people I just named are looked upon as sports and national heroes. I think it's important to look at what we're going through right now with Colin and so many other guys, and try to focus on the perspective that my hope is in 40, 50 years from now, we're no longer having this continued cycle of having to have this discussion about sticking to sports. I hope that 50 years from now, we can just stick to sports. I hope that, 50 years from now, that this country could see that me as a black man has value. I hope that in 50 years from now, the fact that, I'm gonna humble brag for a minute. I hope that in 50 years from now, that an NFL player going on to get his MBA from Wharton and working on Wall Street is a norm, not you did that? How did you do that? I'm hoping that panels like this that are going along all around this country will help us come together. I feel like this panel right now is becoming more about this versus this instead of it being a collaborative thing, which I know for a fact Colin Kaepernick kneeled to create collaboration. He didn't kneel to create divide. It's happened, and I could talk about how media has tried to spin things and so on and so forth to create that divide, but at its core, it is to create collaboration. Because at the end of the day, you're right. I don't have a job without the fans. I don't have a job without the ownership. But guess what? I'm looking around this room, and again, humble brag. I don't see any 6'5", 270-pound 75-pound people that can run a 4.5 and sack Tom Brady and so on and so forth. That also puts fans in the seats to buy those $100. So again, it has to be a collaboration because none of this can happen without me. None of this can happen without Mr. Mayor. None of this can happen without the fan base. So it has to be a way that we can continue to have this discussion. That being uncomfortable. And I don't care about being in comfortable situations. I grew up in Kelton, Alabama, didn't have AP classes, went on to Notre Dame and graduated, and so on and so forth. So being uncomfortable is a norm for me. So I'm cool with that.
Me too.
But that's what we need. So I guess I'm getting on my preaching high horse right now, but to say that the only reason I'm sitting here right now is because I want to continue to create collaboration. It's not about me and you. It's not about the divide that we see. You can be Republican, you can be Democrat, you can be atheist, you can be starch Catholic. I don't care. At the end of the day, if you find a way to better your people, and that's another thing I'm about. I'm about service, and I think all these athletes are about service. We are in gratitude, or we're trying to showcase gratitude of having a platform that we have. So I think the worst thing you can do with that platform is to sit down.
Yeah.
I think the worst thing you can do is not be vocal about something that's at your core. So, I mean, I can continue to talk about this all day, but, I mean, that's my stance on this.
That's amazing. Can I ask you a question? With the kneeling, I do think, and tell me what your opinion is as an athlete, it became about one thing. It's sort of, people were wondering, so wait, what are we kneeling for? And there were so many different mixed messages. And it was like, what was the exact message, and was there something lost in the messaging? And that's how I think there might have been some of the concern with the military. And so what was it about?
It's never been about military. It's never been about, disrespecting our country. It's about being, and again, thank you to the media, because the national anthem is not televised. When have you seen the national anthem televised other than the Super Bowl? Colin was kneeling in preseason. No one knew about it until somebody asked him about it through the media, and that brought on the light to it. So it wasn't like he was like throwing it in people's faces. The media threw it in your face. He was just humbly, quietly going about his protests. That was the origination of it.
But what was he protesting?
The origination was injustices in our black communities at a large scale. Obviously, you can say the names: Trayvon Martin, Castile, Sterling, so on and so forth. That was at its core. When you got video of cops shooting an unarmed black man in the street and nothing happened about it, that was the core. And if Colin doesn't kneel, then that gets swept on the rug and it goes on and just on and on and on and on. And it's not like this hasn't been happening. We just happen to have videos now. We happen to have smartphones. If you think Trayvon Martin was the first kid to be shot unarmed, you're foolish.
Of course.
But I think at its core, what happened was, once Colin started to get national attention for what he was doing, then the spin happened. Oh, he's against the military. He went to a military veteran to figure out how to be more respectful about his kneeling. He was sitting. He went to a military veteran and said, you know what, that might be a little harsh. How can I be more respectful to the flag? He said to kneel. So does that sound like a person that's against the military, that's against our flag? Doesn't that sound like a person that's trying to be collaborative, that's trying to use his platform for change and justice and good? Now, I don't care if you don't agree with it. That ain't what I'm arguing about. Because I told you, I would have my own internal issues about kneeling to the flag. My grandfather was a World War II vet. I would have my own internal issues. But I also understand how this country works and how to get people to notice. You got to do some things. You got to do some things to get people to notice. If you're really about the war, if you're really about what you're about. Muhammad Ali gave up a title belt at the height of his career. You talk about risk. No one talks about, okay, we started off, this panel comes about because the shut up and dribble LeBron James, right? No one talks about LeBron using his platform to build schools. He's not an educator, but no one talks about, oh, he doesn't have the authority to educate. But since he's not a politician, he can't talk on politics. Isn't that in alignment? No one talks about him providing scholarships to low-income kids throughout this country, not just in Ohio, but this country. No one says anything about that. But as soon as he does something that, again, makes us uncomfortable, then we got to, all right, he needs to shut up and dribble. How do you tell a grown man to shut up? First of all, how do you tell a man that's basically the model of what I feel as though athletes could be? LeBron ain't never had any scandals. Married, kids. Put yourself in his perspective. How much pressure is on him? The weight of, I want to say sports, to be honest with you. Every movement he makes is scrutinized, whether it's good or bad. And for him to be able to use that platform for good, we talk more about athletes getting in trouble than we talk about anything else. It's like, that's the news. This athlete got a DUI. That's on the bottom ticker, whatever. We don't talk about their charities. We don't talk about them donating their time to kids. We don't talk about them being advocates for change. We don't talk about, we only got Mondays off. I would say 90% of our guys at the New York Giants spent Mondays at a hospital, a school, or doing a football camp. That don't get publicized. But if I was to go hit my wife, I can never, and obviously that's obviously a tragedy. I'm not trying to say anything good about that. But if I was to do that, how long would ESPN talk about that? Every time my name came up, it could be 10 years down the road. They still, well, he beat his wife. He went on to win Super Bowls and graduate from one, but he hit his wife in 2004. Why is that? And I'm preaching again, but why is that? Why is that? I don't get that.
Well, you talked about we use words like politics and activism. Everything you talked about, the hospitals, the schools, that's politics, right? That's activism. So the focus, you just mentioned it with the domestic violence, the focus tends to be negative. So here we are, I'm trying to be collaborative here. Everything's social activism, right? Social activism doesn't have to be uncomfortable and mad and mean. Going to schools and education, and this is social activism.
And it doesn't have to be refined. I think the question about what are you kneeling for, but what exactly? When I protested, I was 21. I was in school. I was learning. I didn't know it all. I couldn't get behind a podium or on top of a podium and speak specifically about policy reform agendas and demographics about incarceration rates and how they've risen over the years. All I knew was that I was not experiencing democracy the way the country said that it was supposed to be experienced by everybody, and I spoke out about it, right? I identified a conflict between what we say our values are and what the country's actual practices are, and I made a choice to do something different, to make a different choice, to seek a future that was more aligned with that. And I think when we hold athletes to this higher standard or discredit the Black Lives Matter movement because it's leaderless, it's not leaderless, it's leaderful, they like to say. And when we say, well, what's their goal? The goal is justice, right? Like if any of us knew how to untangle a legacy of slavery and oppression, maybe we would be closer to that, right? But we don't know how. This is hundreds of years in the making. It's gonna be just as hard to get out of it, and none of us know how to do that. So anytime somebody has an inkling of an idea about something to do differently, then we need to take a pause and look at that.
What I really appreciate about what you said and what Justin said earlier is it really puts the focus on the fact that movements are about empathy, and what you said, Andrew. The movements are largely about empathy, and when you see people taking a knee or you see people doing education work or the work that you did, that's because people are seeing a value in one another, stepping outside themselves, having this collaborative spirit that you were talking about, and I think we need to take the time to be hopeful. I appreciate that you changed the focus off of the meanness and the opposition, because at the core, it's a really good sign when you see activism, because it means that people are caring and willing to give of themselves to help other people. So we should take the time to celebrate that.
And what you were saying about LeBron, his charity work sounds, philanthropically amazing, but he said he spewed a lot of vitriol to the president, which is his First Amendment right. So why isn't it Laura Ingram's First Amendment right to tell him to shut up? It is. It is. And I know you sit in this room, we from Malibu to Manhattan in academia have to realize that there's a whole world out there. And if you look at that world, Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and your laughs and jeers, it's not the first time, it's not the last, and it's not even the 35th. And if I'll go to statistics, the Quinnipiac poll just shows that 54% of voters believe that the president deserves credit for the strength of the U.S. economy. A Rasmussen poll said 51% of the country supports President Trump. His approval rating is higher than President Barack Obama's at the time.
But we're
so
not
if
here to
nothing
debate
else,
that.
use this as a wake-up call to yourselves.
We're
Realize
not here to debate that, Erin.
But
We're
it's
here.
true, and those are facts. And that's how
Right.
the greater portion of America feels the way that I do, then that way. So that's something to just sit
No, I
and digest
understand.
and
That's what's
process.
brought out this
And it
negativity
makes you
about it.
uncomfortable, but it's the facts and it's the truth. And those people aren't white supremacists. They're hardworking Americans that pay our taxes and fight our wars.
Erin, I think it goes back to your earlier question of what's our end goal. So you've made it clear that you have an end goal about football, but beyond that,
What is my end goal about football?
I am not sure what it is.
You just said I have an end goal about football, so
you were
don't
saying,
say I
what's the end
don't.
goal? The ratings are down. The ratings are down. You have
No, I have no end goal.
There's
My
a
end goal is
limitation
to
around the
repeat
end
the
goal.
statistics.
So 50%,
Don't put words in
54% of
my mouth.
Americans. I'm restating what you said.
I did not say
So
I have an end goal
54%
about
of
football.
Americans who, whatever the data you just rattled off, have some end goal in mind.
No, they
So
don't. They don't want to watch anymore
your
because
end
they don't
goal-
like these antics.
There's an end goal in mind that supersedes all of these other little statistics.
And what is that
There's
end
another
goal?
worldview. That's not for me to answer. I'm not part of that percentage, but my end goal is an America that doesn't look like the way it looked in the past. It doesn't look the way it looks now. It looks more just and more equal than it looks now, and I'm working to go there.
I want to ask a question, and yes, but I want to ask a question on. I don't deal well with statistics because they can be easally skewed.
The Harvard-Harris poll, the Rasmussen
But
poll,
I'll
those
ask
are
you a question.
valid
54%, right? You said 50% of Americans. Well, let's go back to
These are sound statistics.
with respect to viewership being down in the NFL. Does that poll take into account how many people stopped watching the NFL because they were siding with Colin Kaepernick?
No, that would increase viewership because people would start watching because they thought it was a great thing. They should start watching this kneeling.
No.
So why do we think viewership's down?
I've had many conversations with fans that have told me I'm boycotting the NFL because I totally agree with what Colin is doing and I'm appalled by how the NFL is treating them.
I don't know. That's not what any of the articles
Secondly, does that poll take into account the different ways that media is viewed?
Well, that was our subject of last year's
Because
symposium.
last time I checked, these polls do not take into account streaming.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at millennials, I don't know the numbers. I'm just throwing something out there. A lot of them watch on iPads, iPhones.
Streaming is taken to an
Aren't you still a millennial?
Nah, I'm a tweener. I'm a tweener. And I don't think. Again, I'm being very cautious here because I don't have those stats. But having conversations with people around these debates, and it's had a lot of them. So many people have come up to me and said they're stopped watching. Their viewership is being boycotted because they're favoring the movement. It ain't because they're not favoring the NFL, the movement. And obviously, part of that is the other side of the coin, but those numbers are extremely lower when you take into account how many people have boycotted on the other side. And the last time I checked, the NFL doesn't seem to be too worried about viewership. Would you agree with me, Andrew, here?
They just did a new contract on Thursday nights
How much was
that went up 20% from the last one.
It was up 20%.
With Fox, yes.
Let me ask, I know we're getting close to an end, but as we look towards the collaboration, ask each of you, is there one thing you can think of or that you would suggest as part of a solution of how we get more collaborative? How the two sides could come together for a constructive conversation?
I'll start. I'll say when those of you who are local to Villanova may remember when Diane Nash was here, the great activist who helped found SNCC, did the first, continued the Freedom Rides, who has a long, long history of activism. And one of the things that she said was, and if you weren't here, you've seen her and you may know who she is. One of the things she said was she went to the white community during Jim Crow and white business owners in particular and said, what is it that you want and need? We are not going to allow segregation to continue, but that doesn't mean that you have to go out of business, right? So is there a way that we can make that happen? The way that they found to give a particular is that they spoke to white women at liberal churches and said, for every segregationist that decides not to visit these restaurants anymore, will you come in and replace them on a regular basis? And so they did. So they found a way where the white business owners could get what they wanted, which was to stay in business, and the black community could get what they wanted, which was to end segregation. I think that there are possibilities on a lot of different angles. If we're talking about race and sports, for instance, like we've been talking about in much of this panel, then there are ways of turning our attention from, say, a traditionalist audience that wants things to be the way they were, to turning our attention to how to bring in new audiences that are, more progressive or whatever, right? Like, there's a way to say, look, our team can be, or the league can market itself as opposed to the traditional audiences, can look for ways to expand its audience. And the players can help do that. We as fans can help do that. We as academics can help do that. I think, and that's true not just for race, that's true for gender and sexuality issues. I know #MeToo is coming up soon. And there's so much room for expanding the audience in terms of gender and sexuality. So it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game all the time. And some of the creativity of activism is figuring out ways to change it from a us versus them, a zero-sum, idea, to a way where we can all win, or at least nobody has to lose and some people can win.
I love that. I think we need to be honest. I think we operate as though there is a broad agreement in our society about who we have been and who we are and what game we're playing. And we're not being honest that we didn't start equal, we didn't all have the same benefits over the course of the last 250 years, and we still aren't operating from the same definition of what is equal and what is just. So if we're not playing that same game, if some of us are still operating as though white rule needs to be the norm, that it needs to continue, that the many ways that the white members of our society have been able to build a nest for themselves and then build on top of that, if we can't reconcile that with the fact that black folks and other people of color, black folks in particular, and other people of color have not had that, then we're not playing the same game. And so when we're talking about, we're all equal, we're not all equal. So we need to have a really honest conversation about how we define equality, whether democracy is actually at the core of our values. Do we really want that? Because democracy means civic engagement, civic participation. It means evolution. It means things are going to change over time. So if you're not interested in change, if you're not interested in giving up anything that you currently have, we're not interested in democracy. We're interested in something else, and we need to figure out the answer to that.
Well, I guess it's about, again, what we're trying to achieve. And I certainly didn't come with an agenda other than just, to talk and learn. I think Justin was extremely informative to me and taught me a great deal about the movement. I think it's people coming together and having conversations where people don't use words like white supremacist and allude to white privilege. It's more about talking about learning what that movement is really about and what it means to you and someone who has actually lived it. Because then it allows other people to go out and spread the message. Hey, I spoke to Justin Tuck today and he taught me X, Y, and Z. And without throwing terms around and without laughing at people and using derogatory names, it's learning and listening and trying to have a greater understanding, because then there will be change and it will be for the better for everybody.
Last word, Justin.
That's right. Oh, well, I'll make it quick, guys. I think it's important to understand that the system was never written at its core for equality. I think it's important to look past figuring out a way to catch that one bad guy and look a little bit more into what are the system demographics that has forced his hand to be that bad guy. I think collaboration comes from empathy. I think for me personally, anytime I see a person, a human being in struggle, when I personally have so much going right for me, it makes me uncomfortable. So I think collaboration comes first off in yourself. If you watch our news and you look at things that are going on in this country, I won't even go globally, but just in this country, and you're okay with it from a lot of different fronts. I mean, I'm not just talking about, injustices for black people or people of color. I'm in so many different fronts. Activism it's not singular focus. We've talked about many different ways to be active about a cause. Like, if you're okay with our education system right now, I have a problem with you. If you're okay with our criminal justice system right now, I have a problem with you. If you're okay with how we treat gays and queers in our country right now, I have a problem with you. If you're okay with a lot of these things, I got a problem with you. So I think it starts, collaboration, obviously it's a partnership, but it starts with the individual. I think a lot of people have to look at themselves and think about their own personal end goal. Because I've heard a lot of people say, well, that doesn't really affect me. Our criminal justice system doesn't affect you. You're paying higher taxes. That's first of all. You're creating a system where we'll always have this narrative of us versus them. No one's ever right. Just look at history. If you think that dialogue is going to end well, you're crazy. So I'm more of the mindset of getting in front of it before it's no chance of stopping the snowball down the hill. And I'm encouraged for the fact that we're actually having this panel. We're having these discussions. I'm encouraged that we can sit up here and have different opinions and not come to blows about things. Because at the end of the day, but I'm sure there's some people that have the same views as you have that kick my butt. But at the end of the day, man, I think it's all about just making this country the place that we all want to live in, and for our kids to grow up in, and for our grandkids to grow up in. And this place is such a wealth of, one, knowledge. Because if you understand history, you understand that obviously Rome wasn't built in one day, but I mean, you can finish that statement. So again, guys, I'm encouraged by it, and I just think, the more of these discussions we have, the more of these dialogues we have, you'll find a way, I believe, if you really listen and take hold of what people are saying, and that's on both sides. I have to do a better job of having conversations with people that I don't necessarily agree with, because I can't be critical, I can't judge you, I can't say anything negative towards you if I don't understand where you're coming from. And I think the same thing. You can't understand my story if you don't know it. You don't understand where I'm coming from if you don't know it. You can't understand my logics and my thoughts and my opinions if you don't understand where I'm coming from and what certain things have laid on my heart throughout my youth or my experiences. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I feel.
I'll just echo that and say, to achieve change, you have to get uncomfortable to try to be comfortable. And I think this panel is an example of that. I think we're getting comfortable with discomfort, and that's important. Penny Lee, Glenn Bracey, Toni Smith-Thompson, Erin Elmore, Justin Tuck. Great discussion.